Welcome to Dhaka Tribune presents Straight Talk, one-on-one conversations with newsmakers and opinion shapers. I'm Dhaka Tribune editor Zafar Sobhan, and I'm here tonight in conversation with journalist and author Larry Lifschultz. Larry is perhaps best known, especially in Bangladesh, for his groundbreaking and eye-opening reporting and coverage of Bangladeshi politics of the 1970s and early 80s, which has in many ways been the defining work of his life. His seminal work of reportage, Bangladesh, The Unfinished Revolution, remains the definitive account of the execution of Colonel Tahir and the rise to power of General Zia, and is indispensable reading for anyone with an interest in Bangladeshi political history. Now, tonight, what I'd like to discuss is the killings of August 15, 1975, which his writing has done so much to illuminate and to get to the bottom of. Larry, welcome to Straight Talk.
Thank you for inviting me, Zafar.
I'm really looking forward to this. I've been looking forward to having you on this show for such a long time, and I feel that with August 15th just around the corner, this is the perfect opportunity to have you on the show. Now, if we look at the August 15th killings as a puzzle, the full and complete picture of which eludes us to this day, I think it's fair to say that your research and writing has taken us the closest we've come to the truth of that horrific night. Now, why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about how you were able to put the pieces of the puzzle together over the years and slowly start to develop an understanding of the forces behind the killings. Over to you, Larry.
Well, first of all, as we sort of analyze the steps in which one learned more and more about things that were in the dark, we shouldn't lose sight of the terrible tragedy that happened on August 15th.
Yes.
How many people were murdered and how children were murdered, and also women who were pregnant, as those who were initiating the coup and carrying out the coup went around town with different killing squads and killed the prime minister and extended members of his family.
Yes.
So as we analyze this in kind of somewhat mechanical terms of who did what and who knew what when, we shouldn't lose sight of that.
No, I think that's right. The human tragedy is something we should always keep upmost in our minds. And as you mentioned, there have been assassinations in the past in many countries, in many parts of the world. In the US, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, his brother Bobby Kennedy, earlier in the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln. But I think it was the circumstances of the assassination of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and the fact that his family also were targeted, which really makes this an almost unique occurrence in world history, and which is something which we should also, as you mentioned, never lose sight of. So I absolutely agree with that perspective you're taking.
So a little bit of background here.
Yes.
I was a young journalist, and I had, after leaving university at Yale, I had gone to Calcutta. I had lived in India before and worked in Bihar, but I began in 1973 as a stringer from Calcutta and eventually began working for the Far Eastern in Bangladesh in '74. So I spent a year reporting from Bangladesh, knew a great many people, had actually visited East Pakistan in summer of 1970, and actually had met Mujib during that period, quite accidentally, but spent about 2 hours with him quietly alone. And I've described that in an interview that appeared in the Daily Star called In Conversation with Lawrence Lifschultz, which Anisa Rahman of BSS was the interviewer. Yes. So I had background, but in 1975, I moved to New Delhi to be South Asia correspondent of the Review. And it was, I happened to be on August 15th at the Red Fort listening to Mrs. Gandhi give the Independence Day speech, and was contacted by a courier from Reuters who brought me news from my editor in Hong Kong. So I think in discussing this, soon after the coup, there was a view being expressed by the Indian government and by the Communist Party of India and the Communist Party of Bangladesh that the United States was involved in this coup. And although I was open to all sorts of theories, this was one theory that I personally rejected and that should be kept in perspective, because in 1974 there had been a in-depth study of CIA operations throughout the world, and by Senator Frank Church. It was called the Church Committee Report, who looked into U.S. involvement in illegal assassinations or coups, such as in Chile and Lumumba's death in the Congo and other events in CIA history. It just seemed to me implausible that within a year of the Church Committee hearings and their issuing of their report, that there would be any involvement of America in this coup. So I was adverse to that theory. And what I want to try to say in this discussion with you, Zafar, is to point to a number of milestones and encounters that I had in looking into this. And I should say almost every foreign correspondent who reported the coup in August 75 got it wrong. They just reported it very superficially, which is characteristic of a great deal of journalism. And it was a group of majors with a few hundred men under their command who had personal grudges, who went ahead and did this and caused this massacre. So let me talk about one of the first milestones that began to change my mind.
Okay.
I in August got into the country. I was deported. I got in again. I was deported again. Finally, I went from Bangkok. I went back to Calcutta. Went up to Benapole. Got into Dhaka for a couple of days before I was picked up again and deported. So in August, I only had a brief stay in Dhaka to gather information and try to understand what was going on. However, in November, about mid-November 1975, I returned. And at that time, I'll call him Mr. A. I met a Bangladeshi who I knew from the time I lived in Dhaka. Interesting person who I met, and he told me he had something very important to tell me and that we should meet very soon before I left again. So I think I met him within a day or two of that encounter. And he knew Mujib well. He was not happy with what was going on at this time, but he was very distressed about this coup having been carried out and how many people had been murdered. So what he revealed to me was that and this means that we have to, in order to understand what happened in August 75, we have to look back to 1971. Okay. This gentleman was part of a group of people active and working in the provisional government in Calcutta, and was very aware of and had very frequent encounters with Dr. Mushtaq Ahmed and with his colleagues and associates, Mahbub Alam Shashi and Teruddin Thakur, who were his assistants when he was the foreign minister in the provisional government.
Yes.
So what we'll call Mr. A revealed to me was that a special emissary, whose name was George Griffin, had been sent out by Kissinger to Calcutta. And we were able to learn from the local consul general that he really didn't understand what Griffin was doing there or the contacts that he was making. And but this man was very aware of what Griffin was doing. And in the meetings with Mushtaq in 1971. And it was simply and very briefly that Mushtaq was with Kissinger, in which he would travel to New York and, without having consulted the provisional government, declare that they were prepared to make a deal for autonomy and not independence with Yahya, and this would be brokered by the United States. But the provisional government, Tajuddin Ahmed and others, did not know this was going on. I don't know.
Right, this is a back-channeled negotiation.
Right, and I don't know if the gentleman who disclosed this to me, so he was the man who blew the whistle and informed Tajuddin. But at this time, Mushtaq is put under house arrest, and the whole plan is thwarted.
Yes.
Of course, it's ridiculous.
And that was the reason, that was the reason he was put under house arrest.
Right. So, so what the gentleman in Mr. A in mid-November 1975 was saying, Larry, you really have to understand the prior history of the Mushtaq group and their links to the United States.
And the seeds were sown in the summer and autumn of 1971, when there was this back-channel negotiation going on. So that's the context he disclosed to you that when you were in Dhaka at that time.
Right, and I knew nothing about that history, and I don't think many people did at that stage.
Right.
Except those who were close to it. Later, in June of '75, met Mushtaq. He had been thrown out of power by then, and at his home in Dhaka, and asked him about it. And he got very agitated, and he said he wouldn't talk to me about it. And he shouted at me, or spoke in a very loud voice, saying, "Go ask Nixon and Kissinger. They know everything." So, my perceptions, and I think the most important thing about being a decent journalist or aspiring to be one is to be skeptical of oneself and open to the fact that new facts can change your view. So I began to be curious about this connection, because it wasn't accidental that Mushtaq stepped forward after the majors had committed murder, and there were some prior connections. So that's milestone one. And,
yeah.
Okay, so I can move to milestone two if you want me to.
No, that's good. So, I mean, I'm trying to trace the trajectory you're laying out here. So this conversation you had in 1975 was the first real inkling for you that the seeds of this massacre were actually sown in 1971, and there was a bigger story. And not only was there a bigger story, but the story then also in some manner implicated the U.S. government, which was what interested you, I think.
Let's say it made me curious about whether Mushtaq taking over or being pushed forward by the military had what his prior involvement was in the planning of this.
Right, because there was, there's been a sort of a lot of people say, well, he just was sort of found by the majors, and it's kind of like there was a coincidence of needs between them and him, and he was sort of tacked onto the plan. They were searching around for someone who could be a figurehead. But your analysis and the people you've talked to say, well, that is, that's a very sort of convenient historiography, but the reality of it is that there's something far more complicated going on. So please, let's move on to the next stage then. Yeah.
Okay, and Zafar, since we're doing this on iPhone, I no longer have a time measure, so keep me in.
It's okay. I've already made a decision. I'm enjoying this conversation so much, and I think there's so much richness to this discussion. If we go over time, that's fine. We'll take a few minutes. This is the wonderful thing about being on a webinar rather than a television show, is the tyranny of time slots do not apply to us. So as long as we keep the attention of our viewers, and I suspect we will, I think we can take a few more minutes. So, but I will keep you.
Okay.
I'll keep you posted.
Let's move on to. Let's move as one, looks into things, one's thinking on things involved. So
yeah.
During that same trip in November of 1975, I went to visit someone at the U.S. Embassy who I had known well during 1974 when I was living there, and a person who I would call was a critical thinker. And so I sat, let's call him Mr. B. And,
okay, so Mr. A, now go Mr. B. Very good.
He, in the midst of a discussion, sat me down in his office, and he said, obviously he was concerned about the coup and events that had taken place. He was distressed in a certain way. And he said to me that, Larry, the day after the coup, there was a huge argument in the embassy between Ambassador Bolster and Philip Cherry, the CIA station chief.
Yes.
And I don't know exactly what the argument was about, but I do know it was about that something happened that should not have happened. Those were his words. He said, I think you should try to meet Bolster, who I knew slightly from the time I was the Review's correspondent in Dhaka. I had met him once or twice. And he said, I try and find a good time, possibly not in Dhaka, to meet him and ask him questions. So here was a question, an issue that had been raised. The next step was suddenly an U.S. Embassy official was telling me the ambassador is very upset about something. And so in by the 1976, I'm taking a sabbatical from journalism, and I'm living in England. I'm doing some graduate work at Cambridge University, and I, during that period, traveled to Washington, and my colleague Kai Bird, who was with The Nation magazine in New York, but living in Washington as a columnist for them. Kai and I had met in Bangladesh some years earlier, and Kai and I went to meet Bolster, who met us at the State Department. And for 3 hours, we sat downstairs in the State Department lounge. And Kai's father was a foreign service officer, and Ambassador Bolster knew Kai's father. And so it was all very cordial. I don't think Kai or I expected to get anything but, diplomatic denials. And I sort of laid out, by that point, I had been putting together a great deal of information from other sources about 1971, the Mushtaq group. And I'd gathered already some material in the last year or so. And I laid out what I knew about it. And I said to Ambassador Bolster that I didn't name the colleague at the embassy who told me there had been a huge argument that he had with Phil Cherry, and that I understood from other sources that there had been prior contacts between the U.S. Embassy and the and people who were involved in planning the coup. And I said, "Is this true?" So I think Kai and I just expected an answer that would have said, "Oh, that's an interesting theory, but I can't comment on that," or I can't.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Deny, or some other euphemism.
The classic diplomatic.
Bolster looked at me and he said, "It's absolutely true, and everything you've said, and I'll tell you exactly what happened." I mean, our agreement with him was that I could not quote him by name, and although I, was in touch with him later over the years relating to the Solars investigation, which we tried to move forward, he didn't want to be denied. He said until he didn't want to be identified until after his death. There's a whole.
And that's why you waited such a long time before actually mentioning his name. I think it's just a few years ago now.
I think it was on the 30th anniversary. I did a piece for Protomalo, and I had was planning on going to see him in Washington. He was in retirement, and he in July died of a heart attack. In any case, the 77 meeting, he described how he had given instructions to the embassy personnel, all embassy personnel, to break all contact with anyone who was planning a coup against Mushib. He was the antithesis of what I would call the ugly American. The Ugly American was a book written in the 50s, which actually had quite an influence on me when I was in high school. And,
a fine book.
And was hoping that I, like many other young people at the time, as we grew up, we're not going to be the caricature of the ugly American. So anyway,
so Boster, he was very forthcoming, and he actually went way beyond what you were hoping for and anticipating, and was able to confirm what your source, your earlier embassy official source, had said. And in fact, more than just confirm it, he was able to give you chapter and verse in great detail.
Yes, he said, I was shocked after the coup to see that the people flanking Mushtaq on each side of them were people that I had given orders that we should break all contact with. And then he said, it's correct. I discovered that Cherry had been maintaining contact with people involved in planning the coup. Now, he didn't.
And Ambassador Boster was your source for the fact that Philip Cherry had been the CIA station chief, correct?
No, the man before.
Okay.
Mr. B was the one who first identified him as the CIA station chief. I subsequently, I've known a number of retired CIA people who
confirmed this,
and who also knew. And I still to this day am open to hearing Cherry's own version of this. And in the back of my book, one of the appendices is an interview I did with him, which I had someone taking notes and stenographic notes as the discussion was. I think it was in 78 or 79, 78 that I spoke with him from New York to Lagos, where he was in the American embassy in Nigeria. And that's been reproduced, where he denied any involvement or any contacts with anyone involved in the coup. So I told him I had a source that was in the embassy. I didn't tell him who it was. Years later, I was able, in that Protomalo article, to identify Ambassador Bolster. So therefore, here I'm hearing from the ambassador of the U.S. ambassador himself that the United States was involved, something I had completely rejected in 1975. So obviously, I'm just looking at some of my notes here. So this was. These were some of the milestones of changing my view of what I had originally reported as a journalist covering it for the Far Eastern.
As you said, that's how all of the journalists had really reported it. Everyone went with the simple narrative, what seemed to be the obvious apparent narrative, and it was natural to do, but a little bit of digging, and then this is what you found. Yes.
Yes. So let's move to another milestone. As we know, Major or Colonel Farouk and Rashid, Farouk they were all tried. Farouk was tried in Dhaka. Colonel Rashid left and has been out of the country for years. But back in 1997, I was in London for a certain period of time, and an intermediary approached me saying Rashid wanted to meet me. And of course, he knew already some of the reporting I had done. was, of course, he knew I was critical of the of what they had done, and obviously, but nevertheless, it's a long story which I will write up one day. But this long story of why he wanted to meet me, and he couldn't come to London, but he flew into another capital in Europe, and I left London and I met him there in a hotel where he was staying, and spent 5 hours talking to him. And it was strange in some ways, but also I think journalists in certain ways are the psychiatrists of people who are involved in.
But it's our job to listen, right?
Yeah, a lot of people who are involved in things, political actions, and they talk to journalists actually unburdening themselves. So in a certain way, without going into all the details, because there are a lot of things said in 5 hours, and by the way, I'm quite clear that the British knew I was going to meet him. I think they had was leaving London on a train for Europe. I was approached by two special branch officers who asked to see my passport. I showed it to them. I asked to see their identification. They sort of hemmed and hawed and just flashed something at me. But they looked at my passport and then just said, "Have a good trip." And but they were sort of letting me know that they knew where I was going, and I assume that where I was going was also being observed. So, in any case, what was very interesting about there are many interesting things, and I've talked about some of that in the interview that Anisa Rahman did that was published in the Daily Star.
Yes.
Was that I understood a great deal more about General Zia's rule. Now, Farouk and Rashid had earlier given an ITV interview to Anthony Mascarenhas, which appeared on British television, in which they stated that they had been meeting General Zia in the months prior to the coup, and that they had wanted him to lead it, and he had temporized and said the junior officers should move forward on this. I, as a senior officer, can't do this. But in that conversation,
that's the account that's in his book.
Excuse me, what?
I said that, and that's the account that's in his book, in Mascarenhas' book.
Right. Yes.
A Legacy of Blood. Yeah.
And so Rashid and I went into more depth about that, and we also talked about whether he had discussed with Zia whether the Americans had prior knowledge of this, or whether the Americans were all right with this. And Zia had assured him that he had a very good contact at the American embassy, and that there was no problem from the American side. So because Rashid said, of course, I was worried about that too, right? So that was an interesting additional piece of information that I had.
So what we're seeing here is it's not just really a question of them approaching him and him saying, well, yes, I'm not interested, but you guys go ahead. He was actually able to relay valuable information to them, and it seems that he was the one who had a closer connection with people in the U.S. embassy than perhaps they had. That's really what I'm getting from what you're telling us now.
Well, all I'll say is it opened my mind a little bit more. I was sort of still holding back, and but it began to shift my attention from the Mushtaq group as being, the key players here. And maybe, there was an element of plan A, plan B, plan C. If you look at the history of coups that are carried out, that the United States has been involved in, you see that if team one doesn't work out too well, you're going to team two. But also that ultimately sometimes you let the first group get the opprobrium of having carried out terrible acts,
Right.
and somebody else comes from the shadows to replace them. And
Yes,
I think I have increasingly Justice Shamsuddin Chaudhry, during the case in which Colonel Tahir's trial was nullified and overturned, the conviction, asked me when I was in the courtroom what role I felt that General Zia had played. And the press quoted me as saying that I felt he had played a passive role. I don't ever recall using the word passive, and I don't think that was an accurate quote. What I said was he was the shadow man. And but I didn't consider him the most important key player at that stage. I didn't know. And then, of course, as you know, because you published this piece in August of 2018,
that's right.
I, some years later, was back in Dhaka, and in July of 1976, I was back in Dhaka. I had been contacted by some senior military people in Bangladesh to try to come to Dhaka because Colonel Tahir was under arrest and General Zia was about to put him on trial in a secret military tribunal. One of the people who I'd been in touch with who encouraged me once I got to Dhaka to stay was General Manzoor, who I met during that period, and who was very disturbed about the trial. He had been very close with Tahir and had escaped from Pakistan when they went to join the Liberation War. In any case, I had, in July of '76, been at a gathering at a certain businessman's house in Dhaka, and he had said to me, there were quite a number, I was then covering the Tahir trial. He said to me that evening, there's something important I want to talk to you about. And but I can't talk to you, there's so many people here, so can you come tomorrow night so that we can discuss this? And I said, certainly. So I scheduled with him that I would be there the next evening at a certain time, and went back to where I was staying in Dhanmondi. That night, unfortunately, I was arrested and detained. A process of, I was held for about 3 or 4 days. First, they wanted to deport me from India, but I had been kicked out of India during the emergency, so they couldn't deport me back to India. So we had to wait to a flight to Bangkok. So I was held. But I didn't, and I never found out from that businessman what it was that he wanted to tell me that night. Right. So jumping forward quickly, many years later, although I thought many times of trying to look him up or find him or arrange to meet him, other things interceded. Sure. Although you said my defining work was about Bangladesh, well, there have been several other works that have defined me. I've done a great deal of work on Hiroshima and nuclear weapons, and that's right. And also in those many years ago, we were involved in writing and publishing a book on Bosnia. So there have been, plus I'm writing an economic history of late 19th century United States. So Bangladesh has certainly been a very important part of my life, but I wouldn't call it the exclusively defining moment. So,
no, I think we tend to look at it that way, but you're right, of course, that's only a small part of the focus of your works. Yes.
I was actually trying, I feel sometimes haunted by Bangladesh, but it's also one of the most important teachers. Bangladesh has been one of my most important teachers in my life in many ways. And so back to the businessman from Dhaka. So I think it was in 2011, or no, maybe it was later than that. I was back in Dhaka briefly for something, and I called him up. I had his number. I was immediately put through to him, and I said, can I come see you? And I did. And he immediately said, I said, I'm sorry I didn't show up at the appointment from, some 30 years ago. And he said, yes, I was waiting for you. And I said, do you remember it? He says, as if it were yesterday. And he said, it was the work. Why did you have to get yourself arrested that evening? I said, well, bad planning, So in any case, we sat down and had a very serious discussion. And he, at that time, and this is what was described in the article I did for you, which I think was called The Long Road.
In Search of the Truth. In
Search of the Truth, right? So this gentleman told me very briefly that people can go read. This was published in the Dhaka Tribune on August 15th of 2018. And
we republished it again last year,
Right, and I have some editing to do on it so that it's going to go into a volume of sort of collected articles of mine, and which is coming out as a book. That the essence of it was that this businessman had a close acquaintanceship with Phil Cherry, who he believed was a political officer at the U.S. Embassy. And Phil Cherry, several weeks before the coup, was contacted by this gentleman, by Phil Cherry, and asked if he would, if this businessman would be gracious enough to organize a dinner for him, in which certain guests would be invited. The businessman said, "Of course. Who would you like me to invite?" He then specified, according to the businessman, that Bangladeshi businessman, that I only want one person to come, and that is General Zia Rahman. And and of course, my wife will be coming, and his wife, Khalida Zia, will be coming also. So this businessman knew General Zia well, and the dinner was arranged. And as I described in the article that you published, when Zia arrived, he and Cherry went into the garden and spent about an hour there. Dinner was had, and after dinner, Cherry and Zia went back into the garden, and it was all a bit awkward because everybody else had to sit around and chat while the two of the senior guests were not participating in it. But it was then about a week or 10 days ago. Then I had several meetings with the businessman and his wife during that visit to Dhaka and on subsequent visits. And we went over the details several times, and who remembered once. What? The wife thought it was about 10 days before the August 15th coup. The businessman thought it was about a week. In any case, a certain member of the family felt they had been used to set up a meeting, and it was very clear to the businessman that General Zia had played a very significant role in the coup of August 15th. That, in fact, Mushtaq represented a weak civilian face, but without Zia holding back the army, which General Saifullah, in an interview late in Dhaka with me, described in detail, Zia discouraged him from acting quickly to try to save Mujib, and tried to hold back and wait to see what was happening. It is my view that has evolved through this long process of, of lies being stripped away or more in-depth information being available. And there's one more milestone I'll talk to if we have time to.
Sure, I think we can just squeeze it in.
Yeah. It is now my view that Zia Rahman was one of the most important. If there were several architects of the coup, he was the most critical architect. And when everybody else was swept away for one reason or another, the majors became very upset, that thinking they were the key players, but in fact, they were, in a sense, the smaller pawns. And when everyone was shocked and the majors were all, after one incident or another, and identified with the massacres of the August 15th, out of the shadows comes General Zia, sort of clean and squeaky in a sense. But in fact, to me, he is the one of the most important players. So if Judge Shamsuddin were to ask me that question he asked me in 2011, I would have a much more forceful answer than I had at that time. I just called him an important shadow man. So the final thing I wanted to say about milestones was during the 1980s, I became active with some other people in trying to press Stephen Solars, who was head of a critical congressional committee on East and South and East Asia, to investigate prior U.S. involvement, contacts with the with those who were planning the coup. And of course, this would take really a separate discussion. And there is an article that ran, I believe, in 2000 in Protomalo and the Daily Star, called the Solars Correspondence. Right. And you and I have been talking about possibly reprinting a version of that with permission. And I went down after having had correspondence with Solars, and I knew certain people on his staff who kept me informed. I knew them from years before they went to work with Solars. That I knew them was not known generally, but they kept me informed from behind the scenes about why things were not moving forward. And what becomes an interesting story and something that merits an article in and of itself is that ultimately a very strange thing happens. A man named William Barnes is appointed by Solars to head the part of his staff that would deal with this investigation. And William Barnes is a veteran CIA officer. And if you wanted to put the fox in charge of the chicken coop, this was your way of doing it. And I actually made a trip to Washington to try to meet Solars. I couldn't get an appointment with Solars at that time. And but I was given an appointment with Barnes, who sat me down and basically said, you know, this investigation isn't going to go anywhere. And in fact, you're wanting him to investigate a number of people who are my friends, and it's not going to happen. So basically, he was saying, forget about it, kid. You know? Yeah. And yet, I should say, prior to that meeting with Barnes, a man named Stanley Roth on Solars' committee, who later was an undersecretary under Clinton, called me up one day to talk about the letter they were going to write to the State Department, asking about whether there had been prior meetings and specific dates, which of course my source, Ambassador Walster, had given me these dates. And in fact, the Solars correspondence from the answer from the State Department actually confirms that there had been prior conduct. They tried to obfuscate it and say various other things, but they confirmed for the first time what Walster had told us off the record, you know, without attribution. So, Zafar, I don't know how much time we have left, but I mean, I wanted to bring up at the end to draw this as a conclusion. I think this is an important.
Go ahead. Like I said, we are over time, but there's no need. We need to be restrained by the tyranny of time slots. This being a webinar,
Okay.
so a few minutes to just wrap it up. If you have one last point you'd like to make, that's no problem at all.
I think this whole story, and you know, it's a story I've entered and exited and re-entered at various times in my life, is a very important story for not only Bangladeshis but for Americans, because there are some people in America who don't believe in murder as a effective tool of foreign policy, and particularly certain. And I think, you know, it's possible that Phil Cherry, we don't know what was said between Zia and Cherry, but I have a hunch, clearly, that, and there certainly would be documents, memorandums of correspondence, if we can ever get our hands on, if they haven't been destroyed. Of course, similar journalists trying to investigate the Guatemala coup against Arbenz tried to get documents out, and before they were released, they were destroyed.
No, you're absolutely right, Larry. I mean, you know, in this day and age where we have targeted assassinations, I can think just recently of Qasem Soleimani, for instance. So this is certainly still an issue which is very much alive as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy, and I'm sure there are people in the U.S., such as yourself, who would strongly dissent from this kind of a policy being followed. So it's certainly relevant. It's relevant history, and it's not just history. It's relevant in the current time as well. No question about it.
And finally, I want to say about that, I think there may be legal means to raise this here in the United States. And without going into too much detail, there may be a group of lawyers who will pursue this in a way that we can open up more documents and possibly take depositions. I think that's the step forward that needs to be taken.
Okay, super. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, Larry. I mean, I wish we have more time to talk, because whenever I talk with you, I always feel that we could go on for hours. Fortunately, I know that, you know, there are going to be more opportunities. In fact, I believe the two of us are going to be on a panel discussion perhaps a week from now. This is, of course, an important year in the history of Bangladesh, being the 100th birth anniversary year of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujib. And, of course, the month of August is a time where we like to discuss these issues. November is going to come, and, of course, November, if you look back at 1975, was also a very epochal month. November 1975 in the history of Bangladesh. So hopefully we will have the opportunity to build on this discussion. And I know you have certain more writings up your sleeve, which hopefully will come to fruition, and we'll be able to publish them either in a newspaper. I know you have a book you're working on as well. And so I think this discussion will hopefully, I hope that we'll be able to return to it and build upon it in the coming weeks, months, and years. So thank you very much for your time, Larry. This has been great. I think it's been really an eye-opening discussion for the viewers. I think they've learned a lot. I think you've put a lot of meat on the bone, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you in other panel discussions and in other forums. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me, Zafar. All the best.
Okay. Have a good night. Well, have a good day for you. It's night for us here in Bangladesh.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Take
Good.
care.
Super. And for all of those of you who have been tuning in, thank you for staying with us. I hope you found this as interesting and as fascinating a discussion as I have. And please do tune in same time next week, Straight Talk. Thank you very much.